All right. Well, once again, thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Building an Annual Schedule for Fall 2022 into Spring 2023. Happy to have you all on today. My name is Chris Triplett. I'll kind of be moderating today, and joining us, as always, the amazing Laura Kelly, our Vice President for Solution Strategy, who's going to walk you through some of these concepts and some of these really good best practices around building the annual schedule. And I'm really excited for her to share this with you today. So that said, Laura, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and get us started.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Laura Kelly, VP of Solution Strategy. I've been with Ad Astra for about 12 years in a variety of different roles with consulting and a few other things. And I came from higher ed. I was at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro for about the same amount of time in enrollment management, student success, registrar's office, enrollment technologies. So I've been doing scheduling for a long time. I also want to just introduce quickly my colleague and maybe one of the best people I know, Lisa Hunter, who is our VP of Education. She is going to be managing the chat as well as the question and answer. And so like Chris and I, she came from higher ed as well. I'm not sure I can do her introduction justice, but she was a full-time tenured faculty member. And then went to the dark side of administration. That's what she calls the dark side. We usually refer to Ad Astra as that. But so anyway, lots of great higher ed experience, and she's going to be managing on that end. So you'll see her in those two venues, and you already do. She's already chatting with you. So I am going to just move forward, and we're going to talk a little bit about the agenda. So Chris has done a great job with the welcome. He is also one of the best people that I know. You can tell there's a lot of love for our employees here at Ad Astra. We're going to go through some brief training logistics. Then we're going to talk about scheduling for student success. We're going to go through the process of annual scheduling and how we think we can transform how scheduling is done. We're going to have some next steps and then our upcoming trainings. And what's missing in there is a Q&A section, which we will have some dedicated time for that. And we'll talk about that in just a moment here on the training logistics slide. So for now, all of the participant microphones are muted. And so that's just an opportunity for us to kind of go through some of the content. During that time, if you have questions, please utilize that question and answer feature that's available within the webinar. And as I mentioned, Lisa will be monitoring that. So we will answer questions during that dedicated question and answer time. But if it makes sense for me to address something during the Q&A, Lisa will prompt me. And so we'll kind of dive into it based on where we are within the overall presentation. So, so please interact with us. I think, this is one of those topics where the client interaction is maybe more important than anything that we are presenting. And so we want to hear about what you're doing from an annual scheduling approach, what you want to be able to do. So I'm just prompting you to say that we love that dialogue. So please either add your questions in the Q&A or save them until the end, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. So I want to start off just with our framework called Managing the Academic Enterprise. And so you can see from our perspective, the focus is on the student. And so it's optimizing degree velocity to improve student success throughout the industry. That's our goal from a company perspective. Most of you know that we started in more of the infrastructure framework or bubble here with our Astra Schedule product. And we've been in business for 25 years, and we focused a lot of attention from my perspective early on in just how to manage your space and how to do things better from an overall calendaring perspective. When I came on board with Ad Astra, it was really when they started moving a little bit away, or at least delving into a different area, which we're going to call schedule refinement here. And it was really an idea where we saw that there were space bottlenecks or things occurring within the Astra schedule realm. But the way to attack that problem was actually through your core scheduling. So if you're running out of space, as we were back when I was at UNCG, and you wanted to be able to better utilize that space, ultimately you needed to offer things a little bit differently. And so that led us down the path of schedule refinement, and working with both your historical data as well as your predictive student data to, in the moment, determine what you should do next. So over the past couple of years, and this fits right in with this concept of annual scheduling, we realize that sometimes in schedule refinement, you are also get stuck. You can't do the recommendations, you can't make the changes because you're already to the point of registration, and maybe there's an offering that's only going to have 5 students in it, but those students need to graduate. So you have to offer that course regardless of what's being recommended. Or maybe in the moment of schedule refinement, you don't have enough time to add additional instructors to allow more students to flow through those programs. So, and that led us to these other bubbles. So how do we help understand the ideas around instructional capacity, the financial implications of how you're doing scheduling, pathways and the role that they play in building what your schedule should be as you move forward, and how they impact overall student success. And then from an enrollment health lens, understanding when you can afford to make different moves from a scheduling perspective. So where do you have enough students that need to take courses that you can offer them in multiple different ways? And so we're going to talk about all those things today, but what I want to focus on is not only is student success in the middle of that bubble, if ultimately the schedule is the way that students get to that ultimate credential or degree or whatever they're pursuing, then the schedule is also in the middle of this bubble. And so I want you to think about that as we kind of go through this presentation, because what we're really saying is that you have to consider elements of all of the managing the academic enterprise in order to do an annual schedule, especially if the goal from an annual scheduling perspective is to improve a student's ability to complete on time. So just a couple of things that I want to point out as we contextualize scheduling for student success and what makes this important. So I'm referencing here a survey from ACRO, which was a 60-second survey asking about scheduling. And so there's lots of good information in there. If you have a chance, check it out. But I just want to mention the first thing here, which is when institutions, and I want to say there were 870 maybe institutions that were covered in this particular survey, when they asked the most important factors in scheduling, and that's based on the ones where they said important or very important, faculty availability was the #1 factor for them in scheduling. The second was time block popularity. The third was courses scheduled at the same time as last year. And then I'm pointing out this blue figure here, which is less than 50% of the respondents felt like the most important factors was that the data should be driven based on student plans of study. And the student plans of study, or the courses that students need next, were not used by at least 33% of the respondents. So something is interesting for me there. I mean, obviously we've been working in this business for a long time, and we know that faculty-centric scheduling has been maybe the way that we do business, especially from that roll forward and tweak perspective when you think about courses being offered at the same day and same time as last year, which I think what we're going to say is a good thing. That structure is helpful even from a student's perspective, but we just need to think through how annual scheduling and how our overall scheduling meets the needs of our students. The second piece of data that I want to point out here is something that we've quoted the whole time that I've been at Astra from Rufford Noel Levitt's Student Satisfaction Survey, that just says that up to 50% and maybe more are dissatisfied during the registration process. And having a sophomore in college myself, I can tell you that there's been a lot of dissatisfaction at my house concerning the registration process overall. So it's something that we hear when we talk about what we do, when we meet people in the industry. We hear a lot of complaints about a student's ability to get the course they need when they need it. And sometimes we get some pushback, and institutions will say, well, but that's because they have unrealistic expectations. It could be some of that, but more often than not, we're talking about situations where a student needed a requirement and weren't able to get it, and then they have to scramble or figure out what they're going to do. And the reason that they have to scramble is because we have a very diverse student population with various needs now. You know, over 60% of the students that are seeking undergraduate degrees fall into that post-traditional bucket. More and more students are working. So that means that the need for them to understand how their education fits into their life is really important. And an ability to plan ahead is something that I think is key to overall student satisfaction. I also think when students become dissatisfied, it is often about not having those expectations met. So I think we've talked a lot about if you can be upfront with students and tell them, hey, I know that you're usually an online student, but there's one class where we can only offer it in person, which probably isn't a good example from the COVID perspective these days. But if that type of thing is communicated to the student upfront, I don't think you experience that type of dissatisfaction. But if they go through the entire program, they get to that course and it's not offered in the way that they think it's going to be offered, that's when they start to see a little bit of dissonance. So overall, what we're saying is the student population is different than what it's ever been before, and the ability to schedule in advance is something that's highly anticipated by students. So speaking of scheduling in advance, this is, again, from that ACRO 60-second survey, and something that I just want to point out here, and you can see on the right, the full breakdown, but 62% of the schools that were responded to the survey mentioned that they schedule an academic term or less. And the or less is very interesting to me too, right? But something that's interesting, of course, is that really most of our institutions are just doing it a term at a time. And many of you are probably fit into that bucket. There are 18% of the folks that were that responded that do schedule a full academic term in advance, but only 6% of those institutions allow a student to register. And so we've heard a lot of comments from our clients about allowing students to register more than one term in advance. What does that mean from a retention perspective? How does that lead to greater student success? But then also there's some downsides in terms of, you know, can you offer that second or third term in a predictable format? So when they are registering, they feel like it's something that's going to stick, and that's really what their schedule is going to be for the upcoming term. So most institutions that we work with do something like this. So this is schedule refinement today. And I'm going to talk about the process in just a moment. But when we start working with institutions, usually they are doing the roll forward scheduling. Departments refine those offerings in silos. They update their student information system. Room assignments are made, and then the final schedule is posted before advising and registration. But we always put that final in quotes because, as you know, there is never a final schedule really until after the term starts. What we try to work with institutions on as we're doing schedule refinement is just adding more data to that process. So still, most of our institutions roll forward, but we're making change recommendations for situations where you may want to add seats, situations where you can be a little bit more efficient, meaning that departments are now refining that course schedule in a way that's based more on data and less on kind of that siloed approach. Still updating your student information system, still optimizing and making room assignments based on the requirements and seat fill, and then same thing happens. Final schedule is being posted, but changes are still occurring. So while this is good and something that we talk with all of our clients on and how we work with institutions, ultimately, it still doesn't allow for that mechanism to be able to plan ahead. And so the downside of even the best schedule refinement process is that you're still planning right in front of the spring registration period and then planning right in front of the fall registration period. And so the ability to get that kind of structure in place for students and understand how they can complete isn't there. So I've been talking at here at Ad Astra for a long time about the off season. So it feels like, as I said, in the moment of scheduling, this is really hard because sometimes you're handcuffed. You can't make the decisions that you would like to make because it's too late in the cycle. You can't add an instructor, maybe even you can't, cancel a section either from a student's perspective or from a faculty's perspective. And so I keep borrowing from the sports metaphor. Any of you that have been around Ad Astra for some time should know that we love a good sports metaphor. So I'm just continuing that. And you can see this little graphic, the best athletes made during the off season. The off season is where you can work more on your individual skills, and then during the season is where you're functioning as a team. So I'd like to say that part of this is thinking about your individual schedule from a department's perspective, but then also figuring out how it can fit into that team approach, how we can be more collaborative across departments, because knowing that most students are taking courses not just within that single department as they're moving forward. So this is really what we're talking about. So if we're going to plan a schedule for fall of 22 to spring of 23, how would we go about doing that? So the first step that I want to talk through is just establishing some goals. So what are you trying to accomplish with your annual scheduling process? How are you trying to help that meet the needs of your students? What does success mean? Is there a certain amount of change that needs to be, minimized in order for an annual schedule to be successful? Are you trying to move to 8-week terms, which is something that we hear quite often these days? Are you trying to build out more modalities? Are you trying to ensure that you've learned some things from COVID and maybe you don't have to offer as many face-to-face classes in situations where your enrollment's going to be very distributed? So understanding what your plan is really important as you go through this process. And in the institutions that we're working with on this, about 70 to 80% of the schedule should be planned in advance. So you're still going to always need schedule refinement, right? You're always going to have situations where instructors are, moving, changing. Your student population is going to be changing slightly in terms of enrollment and distribution throughout your programs. So there's always going to be that schedule refinement need, but how do we plan for the majority use case and then tweak on the fringes is something that we want to talk through here. When you're thinking about how to set your goals from an annual scheduling perspective, we recommend that you find that why. So that's something that's become important for us. I know you've seen Simon Sinek's work on the why, which focuses less on the how, less on the what, more on the why. And from our perspective, that means you need to think about some of these things. Are you trying to make sure that you're able to keep your completion promises to your students? Are you planning to move to block scheduling? Are you more focused on resource efficiency or financial sustainability? Most institutions are focused on all those things together. So how do you make that work from an annual scheduling perspective? And I want to point out the right-hand side of the screen, which is the danger. So oftentimes we hear that there's an initiative that has been sort of passed on that you need to have an annual schedule. And what people do is just try to implement what's the easiest way to say that we have done this, right? And that means they roll forward multiple terms at the same time and they say they have an annual schedule. Well, I'm going to argue that that's not what we're talking about here, that true annual schedule planning, it takes a step back, looks more at your pathways, isn't just looking at historically what you've been offering in the past. So after you have your goals, then we would hope that you'd want to plan your schedule for completions, and we would hope that you would want to utilize pathways in order to do that. So most institutions that we work with now have pathways, or at least that recommended sequence of courses that students need to complete. And so the first step is probably to get clear on the language here. So pathways for us means what you need to take in the first term, second term, third term. It isn't necessarily guided pathways in the sense that we're not saying you have to limit all your course choices or those types of things, but what we are saying is ideally, how would you want your student to flow through this plan? When they come in to freshman orientation, what are the first 5 courses that you're recommending that they take? And so, and what that means is you can take those pathways as a structure step and say, okay, if I have 7 pathways in my school and I have these courses on all of them. Are they recommended in fall and spring in each one? Are some recommended only in fall? Are we doing that intentionally or in a haphazard way? So I had an institution we were working with on Pathways Design. They had 7, as I just mentioned, business programs. 6 of the 7 had accounting in the fall term. The 7th had it in the spring term. Is that by design to even out the courses, or is that kind of a strategic miss where you just weren't aware that that's what you were doing? And so the pathway becomes this very strategic element, not just for students, but to connect your schedule with how students should complete. Obviously, we always have to consider prerequisite and co-requisite requirements as well. From our perspective, this is how we should be using pathways from a scheduling perspective. Most institutions that we work with are on either this kind of definition of pathways or analyzing their pathways, and we don't really have any institutions that are to this far right end of the continuum, where they are fully integrated with advising, scheduling, registration, and their pathways. They're able to look and see situations where they can improve first-year momentum or productive credits or things that are happening because they're watching their pathways, they're seeing how students are flowing through, and they're able to move in that direction. So what we're trying to work with most institutions on is this kind of what we're talking about today. How do we schedule for pathways? How do we plan for continuing and new students? How do we evaluate how this is working? And how do we make tweaks to that annual plan in order to ensure that students have access to courses? And here's the why. So when institutions implement pathways, they believe that it's going to be more like the top part of this screen, where students are able to get the courses that they need term 1, term 2, term 3. Most students that we see, most institutions that we work with, what you see is more like that bottom half. So you have a plan for the student can't get into that first English level course because all the sections are full. They don't end up taking Biology 125 because they were advised to take something else. They can't yet get into Psychology 130 because a prereq wasn't met in the previous course, or the prereq wasn't even designated as something that they needed to take in the previous course. They can't get into the course where because it's only offered in the evening and they're a daytime student, or they need to take Chemistry 180 and Math 200 and they're offered at the same day and same time. So what we're trying to say is there's some ways from a planning perspective to ensure that those things don't happen. And even if you can't ensure that all of that complexity is managed, we can figure out ways to mitigate the risk. You know that more and more students are taking dual credit. We also know that there's tons and tons of transfer work that's coming in. So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all plan here where you have a true cohort-based type of program where you can ensure that students are always completely on path. But there's some ways to make sure that we're doing this a little bit better. So the next step is to take a look and see what type of data you have available to you in order to help make some of these decisions. So you know from your pathways perspective what you're planning to offer, or what the pathway says you should offer. Now let's start to think about all of these different pieces. So the first one is your current and projected enrollment. So how many students are coming into your pathway? What does it look like when freshmen enter your program? What does it look like when transfers enter? Do you have lots of transfers that come from a community college so you kind of know the type of credit that they're going to have? Do you know how undecided students flow into your program and what impacts does that have? And I think all of us are very well aware of enrollment fluctuations over the past year. So what can you anticipate based on what you know from an overall institutional perspective? You can also look at your historical data. So you can look and see what you've been offering in the past, what are the enrollment ratios, or that's basically just kind of a seat fill metric. So how full have your sections been? Are there any situations like maybe that English 106 course from the previous example where you know you have a lot of unmet need? And on the other end of the spectrum, are there some situations where there's some low enrolled sections where you end up canceling them? And in those cases, can students find something else that will help them move forward on their plan? And then finally, there's some other things listed here. I like to share an example from one of our close friends that works at a community college. When she came to her new appointment, one of the things that she did is she just wanted to manually look and see, are the pathways that we have listed, are the courses offered in those terms? She had 67 pathways, and there were 12 of them that really offered the courses in the term that they were recommended. And so that seems like an easy problem to fix, right? It can get a lot more complicated than that, but I would say that just the nature of how we built pathways, sometimes in a kind of a disjointed way from our schedule, is what can lead to those types of things. So there's lots of opportunity in looking at the historical data metrics. Here are a couple of examples of things that we look at. So we look at how many courses have had greater than 95% enrollment ratio, and we want to know, are there situations where we could add seats? We always want to look at your single section course offerings. So that's where sometimes you see those student conflicts where students need more than one course and they can't get into one. So if almost 70% of your schedule is offered as a single section, what does that mean from your students' perspective? We also like to focus on first year bottlenecks. So if it's really important for students to get off on the right track from a momentum year perspective, and 37% of our first year courses are bottlenecked, what does that mean? And so these are some examples of metrics, but ultimately, as you know, there's lots of data out there for us to review. And as you're building this plan, what we would argue is you need to focus on what's most important in your institutional why, what you're trying to accomplish from an annual scheduling perspective, and then that helps you understand the types of data that you need to review. So the next step is to just build that scheduling model. So take your pathways, build out what needs to be offered in fall and spring as you move forward, and then figure out the data that you want to analyze in order to determine the number of courses, number of sections that should be scheduled. Most folks that have worked with me know that one of my sort of mantras is you just have to start. And as we're getting into step 4, I think you can already realize that there's tons of complexity here. And honestly, I think the reason that we don't do this type of scheduling is because it's hard. There's so many factors at play: your students, your buildings and rooms, your faculty availability. All of those things are really important as you're going through this process. And as you layer in more and more data, there's more complexity at play. But I would say we just have to start. And it doesn't mean that you're going to get all the way there, but iterative improvement is something that's really important. And so my advice here is let's just start with doing a sample and then see what it looks like. Here are a couple of examples of what we see out on the web as sort of those course rotations. So, and if you have this already, this might be a great starting point where you can look to see, hey, what we publish on the web, is it the same as what really happens in the schedule? When you have a situation where courses are listed as needed, what does that mean, right? What are situations maybe with this Accounting 240 example where you say you're offering it fall semester every year, you're also offering it in the first 8 weeks of fall semester online and spring semester in the first 8 weeks. How does that play with what you're offering in terms of Accounting 241? So, and is that the right mechanism for how you want to roll that out? So structurally, just looking to see what your plan is, how does that align with your pathway, is something that's really important. This is another example, and I share this because it almost gets overwhelming very quickly, right? So you're trying to figure out what's going to be offered, and you can see there's all these ORs included in requirements. You can see that in some situations you have prereqs that you need to consider, and so this type of planning can be difficult because there's a lot of complexity even at that individual department level. And so you have sort of even years and odd years. What happens if you have to cancel a section that is only scheduled for even years? Does that mean a student has to wait 2 years to get that course? So lots of pieces of information need to go into that. And so just a couple of examples to illustrate that point. So we're on to step 5. And this is where I think one of the things we want to talk about is how complex do you want to allow this to be? So in the previous step, we're talking about, optimizing for your most common use case. So for some institutions, maybe that's your most common use case is the full 16-week term. So do we want to optimize your schedule for that and build that out? And frankly, I think that's what most people do. They build out that sort of standard 16-week, but then when they build out the additional elements, when they start to think about, okay, if a part-time student is doing this plan, what does that mean? You know, does that change even the order of how you want them to progress through the program? Do you need to consider DFW rates? Do you need to consider toxic course combinations? Do you need to think through some of those types of things? We had an institution recently where we were doing some analysis work, and if students took English and math in the first term together, that was the worst combination for them, which is interesting because that's what we're recommending for students from a momentum year perspective as well. So does that mean we need to consider how to place those two courses in, one in fall, one in spring instead? You know, sometimes there are courses that fall into those toxic course combinations that aren't what you would expect. You know, most of our institutions think that it's science courses, math courses, things like that. We've had a couple of institutions where it's a political science and a psychology together. So understanding your courses, how students flow through the programs, and where some of those course combinations might be an issue. I would also say that you can do the opposite. So looking to see situations where students are more successful because they're taking sets of courses in concert. That can help you from a pathways perspective, but also from a student success perspective as well, understanding how to go through this process and schedule courses that make sense together. Most institutions now that we work with are offering multiple parts of term. And in fact, many of them are moving more and more into that realm with 8-week terms. So we have some institutions that have done that in a very thoughtful way. We have other institutions that are just trying to roll out some things so that they can help students. And the early data based on, 8-week terms is that it's, super successful. The retention rates are really good. If a student has to stop out, they're still completing something and making progress towards that degree. So how can we layer in multiple parts of terms in ways that make sense? How are we able to embed? So in the example I used before, where you have sort of accounting 1 and accounting 2, how can students complete that in the same term now and maybe get to that certificate a little bit more quickly? We've always talked a lot about daytime versus evening offerings. And I think the emergence of online has changed some of that a little bit, but there's still students who want to be face-to-face and want to take evening courses. But how are you being planful in that approach? Can students really complete in an evening, or do you have to augment that with online or other types of courses? And then finally, modality, right? Are you searching for degree completion online? Are you optimizing to allow for online courses to augment your on-ground courses? So understanding your strategy at each level of this is really important. And so what I would say is most institutions are doing all of these things, but they're maybe doing them in pockets and not moving in the direction of trying to make this kind of a complete planning experience. So I have several slides coming up that are just kind of different pieces of data, things to consider and look at. And, one thing that I just want to point out that I failed to mention in the beginning is we don't think we have all the answers. And this is, from my perspective, a way to change the way that we're thinking about scheduling, an overall change in methodology. So while we think these are the right steps to take from a logical approach to scheduling, we're still working on how to augment the data to help you guys as we go through the schedule building process to ensure that we're giving you the types of insights that are needed to make these types of decisions. So I'm not going to go through all of these slides, but one of the things that we did want to talk about, and I already touched on it, is kind of that breakdown between full-time and part-time and how to optimize what you're offering. So when we go into a 2-year school and have some conversations about momentum year, for example, we get a lot of pushback, frankly, and a lot of times it's because we are trying to protect the students that are working, and maybe we want them to be successful, so we're not recommending that they take that full-time load. And we say, well, 67% of our students are part-time. And so one of my questions for that is that a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, can those students be successful in taking 12 credits and maybe picking up 6 in the summer? And what this report is just showing is that full-time students do better in community college. This is just an example, of course, but can you optimize to full-time? Can you make the scheduling such that allows students to take more courses because the way that they're grouped together? So it's not just, it's the old adage of, can you get a schedule versus you have a good schedule? And so that's definitely something to consider when you think about transportation. Can students come on campus, get the courses that they need, and then go out and do the other things that they need to do in their life? So just something to think about in terms of, do we want to optimize for full-time or part-time? And can we push students to go more in that full-time realm, knowing that time, as we talk about, is the enemy of completion? So we can also talk about kind of student success metrics and degree velocity. So how quickly students are moving towards degree in terms of overall time. I'm going to skip through a couple of these slides because I want to be sure that we have time to just chat at the end. So here is an example of something that we worked with for an institution. And so what you can see here is something that we are calling completion tracks. And so a completion track, if you think about it, is really kind of the way that you're offering your courses. So is it in the full term, and is it in the day? Is it online? And how do those things work together? So for this particular school, what you can see is that their 16-week day classes on their main campus is their primary mode that they offer their courses. Okay, they do have some sort of main campus evening offerings. They have some online evening and day. They have some 7-week courses during the day. And this is what we see at most institutions, is some sort of breakdown of this. So step one is just analyzing, what is it that you're offering? How are you rolling out your schedule, and how does it meet the needs? And so this is at an institutional level, but we also need to do that down at the department level and understand how those departmental offerings also play into the general education offerings and those types of things overall. And so when we go out and do studies, and we're talking about specific buildings and rooms, sometimes one of the things that we hear is, it's okay for us to schedule differently because our students are only taking our courses. But more often than not, that's not 100% true, right? We are still having situations where they need to take gen ed classes or things like that, and it does have an impact if the scheduling that you're doing is different than the scheduling that other departments within your institution are doing. So I don't want to go into a lot of detail because this is an overload of data. So kind of disregard the chart and just kind of look at some of the overall findings. So for this institution, 69% of the students are either only taking courses in the 16-week term. 25% of 7-week courses also take a course in the 16-week term. And so the reason that we're trying to break down this kind of primary way that students are taking courses versus secondary ways that students are taking courses is because they're taking them in multiple terms. And the question is that because they want to or because they have to? So if you're rolling out 7-week terms, but students can't get a full schedule in 7-week terms, what does that mean for them, right? And so also, if you layer that data with who's being successful, how do we consider what's happening there? Are students more successful in 16-week terms? Are they more successful in 7-week terms? Is blended better? Something to consider from a part of term perspective. Same thing for time of day. So you can see in the bullet points here, students that are utilizing both day and evening courses are progressing more quickly for this institution. Evening students are more likely to only take evening classes. So what that means is that sometimes day students have to dip into the evening, probably because they can't get it during the day, right? But again, using this data to help consider the options is something that's really important. So I don't have a slide here, but obviously we have the same type of information on modalities, and you can see it is included from an asynchronous perspective here in terms of offerings, but an asynchronous offering can be used to augment as well. So lots and lots of data to be able to consider here. Okay, so we've talked about the time of day, we've talked about online versus on ground. We've talked about all kinds of different pieces of information using the pathway as the structure. Now we need to talk about an instructional capacity play. So we need to consider how your existing meeting pattern grid fits with your scheduling model, and we need to understand if changes need to take place. So step one for a lot of institutions is that they just need to make sure that their existing standard meeting pattern grid doesn't have overlapping meeting patterns to start, right? And most of them do in some cases because of the nature of 4 credit hour courses or 3 credits and 2 credits and 1 credit. But step one is to make sure that you're doing it for the most common use case. So I might go into an institution, they say, oh, but our grid has to account for 4 credit meeting patterns, and that's a big deal for us. And when I look at the data, it says that 2% of their overall offerings are 4 credit hour courses. So some of what we're doing here is even, I like to call it myth busting. You're taking the data and you're trying to make sure that we're considering it with the weight that it needs to be considered. We also have to consider labs or studios. How does that fit with your overall scheduling model? There's lots and lots of new ideas here. We have lots of institutions that are trying 4-day-a-week patterns. We have situations where they're trying to keep general education courses into certain realms. All kinds of things are happening. And of course, we haven't had a lot of this on-campus scheduling, or if we have, we've had to be even more creative because we have to split the sections into hybrids. We have to have smaller class sizes. Lots of things have happened from a COVID perspective on this particular point. But the point that I would make is you also need to understand your overall utilization. So if you're going to implement a block schedule, and maybe move to 8-week terms, that's going to change the meeting pattern time that exists within your current schedule. So trying to make sense of all that complexity, build out that meeting pattern grid that makes the most sense, and be able to take advantage of your existing capacity. So one thing to consider there is looking at how you've been offering courses over the past couple of years. So every institution we've ever worked with has a prime time, as you see on this list, usually 9 to 2. You can see that Friday usage is pretty low, even after the 12 o'clock hour, and Friday usage in general for this institution is a lot lower than their other courses. So think through what you want those meeting patterns to be if you are going to go with a 16-week versus an 8-week. How are you going to structure your schedule so that you have the space availability to be able to do those things? So part of that is your kind of day and time usage throughout the prime week is what we call it versus the standard week. You also need to think about how you currently are utilizing that space. So those institutions that have worked with us know that when you get to about 80% utilization is when we start to worry. Like maybe you need additional space, maybe you need to offer additional online classes, things like that. And so you can see for this institution in their general classroom use spaces at 74% are starting to approach that 80% timeline. So for institutions that have plenty of space and coming out of COVID, I'm hearing more and more that institutions feel like their space is okay because they are going to continue to offer more online or more hybrid following the pandemic. Then you probably have the space capability to do what you need to do if you're implementing different meeting pattern grids associated with this annual schedule. But you have to take into account the instructional capacity in order to make sure that the plan that you have is able to be realized. So the final step here is after you have that model to publish that to your students. And there's lots of different ways to be able to do that. And so I'm not going to even go into a lot of detail here. So it could be that you roll out the schedule in your student information system early and you let students register. It could be that we're publishing that a little bit more within like a course rotation on your website. It could be that you're telling them, here are the tracks that we are supporting. You know, for this program, you can do it completely online asynchronously. For this program, we're only going to do day, and there might be an evening course here or there. So if we get back to those earlier comments about student success and overall satisfaction, if we can communicate how they can complete their degree, and it actually works in the schedule, I think that's the key to more or greater student satisfaction. And I think it also, from an institutional perspective, it helps us be able to plan ahead as well. And so that's really, really important. Okay, so I don't think any questions have come in so far. I do think there's maybe some conversation happening in the chat, but it's hard for me to keep up and talk at the same time, as you guys might imagine. But we're ready to kind of transition into the discussion and feedback.
Awesome. So, well, yeah, what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and give everyone the ability to talk. Not that you haven't had that ability in life, but in this webinar, I'm going to give it to you. So that's some fun power that I have. But I'm going to go ahead and unmute those on the call, and feel free to continue to use, if you don't want to talk, feel free to use the chat. I know we've had some good conversation going back and forth there, but I'm going to allow folks to jump in. So your ability to talk will be with you shortly.
All right. I'm not sure if everyone can talk or not, but maybe Lisa, I know that there's been a little bit of back and forth in the chat. Is there anything
Nobody wants to talk with me in the chat. Everybody's being very proper and paid very close attention to you as the presenter, Laura. But I bet there are questions about whether or not folks will get the recording. And so we will definitely follow up with the recording. But I thought maybe, Laura, while everybody's thinking of their questions, you could talk a little bit about the article, and then I could share that resource as well, because I did mention to everyone that they don't have to take notes, and that we'd have a little resource with the steps.
Perfect. Great. So yes, we are just publishing an article that I wrote that's very similar to the content that you received today. That's just about sort of scheduling in the off season. I continue that baseball metaphor, but that should be coming out soon, and it includes the steps that we've talked about. You'll see some of those resources that I mentioned, the 60-second survey, some interesting data on the students post-traditional and what they need and those types of things. So yes, we do have an article that pretty closely aligns with what we've talked about today, and outlines those steps along the way.
And everyone should be have the ability to talk if you'd like to talk. So feel free to unmute and jump in and ask a question or give some feedback or comments that you might have if you'd like.
Laura, I'll ask a question, if that's okay.
It's really good, but I hope you're going to make it something I can answer. So.
Well,
I did say you're one of my favorite people, so.
I know, there's a lot of pressure. So, you did title this session kind of a year out. Like, could you talk a little bit about the timeline? Like, should we get started ASAP if we want to publish an annual schedule, for starting next fall? Are we already behind the times? Like, I know there's no easy answer, but like, what's your sense of, given all the complexity here?
No, I think I think it's a great question. And oftentimes I think that's why we get kind of stuck in that schedule refinement lens. So most of you are probably, anxiously awaiting all of your students to show up for fall of 21, and maybe starting to transition into spring of 22 planning. So what that means is it's hard to just go ahead and start planning fall of 22 as well. But I think now is kind of the time, right? So as you're kind of finalizing that spring 22 schedule, transitioning to looking ahead to fall 22 and beyond, because fall 22 scheduling will start January or February, right? So that's really when we usually start doing that type of analysis work. So if we go ahead and start thinking through at least some of these concepts, start gathering some of the data that you might want to use, then that feels like it's the appropriate time to be able to move forward on this kind of different approach. If you wait until kind of in the moment in January or February, then it feels like you're just going to continue that schedule refinement process. So I would say now's the time. As I mentioned, kind of just start. Try to figure out at least the types of things that you want to be able to consider. Maybe it's you want to focus on scheduling to your pathways, or maybe you just want to do that kind of simple analysis. Are the courses that are listed on the terms that we have them in their pathways available in those terms? That seems like a step that's attainable, right? And then the next step could be, are we offering things in 8-week and in 16-week or whatever is salient to your institution? But I think there's, if you try to do this whole picture at the same time, there's a lot of data to gather, a lot to think through. But if you can just kind of figure out what your mission is, what you're trying to accomplish, and then take some baby steps in that direction, I think that's where we're headed.
Thank you. We'll open the floor back up for questions. Joe, I did see you unmute at some point. Did you want to jump in and ask a question?
Yeah, sort of. Joe Shively at Oakland University. Sort of a question, sort of a looking for wisdom. And we were talking about this with Debbie yesterday. We do annual scheduling. So the question I was talking with her about yesterday is when it comes to having our chairs use a line as they are building the schedule this fall for fall 22, and we are winter rather than spring because winter never ends in Michigan. Winter 23, the challenge there is that in doing that this fall, we haven't gotten to our winter 22 census yet when we're doing that process. So some wisdom about maybe how to take advantage of what we may have learned in the winter 21 term to help us think about winter 23.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think post-pandemic, it makes it even a little bit more tricky, right? Because
yeah, absolutely.
I think as we move into 22 and 23, like planning for 23 right now seems overwhelming because we don't know what that student's response is going to be. But so a couple things I would say is that, again, it feels like from that annual scheduling approach, you're kind of trying to take that step back and just see from a performance metric perspective what's been happening. So I would say, looking at 21 and seeing bottleneck courses, right? Looking at 21 and seeing which courses you had to cancel and how did that fit with the pathways plan, right? Looking for situations, we have some data and an ability to evaluate your pathway and see the percentage of students that actually got the course they were supposed to get by the time they were supposed to get it, right? So my advice is try to link it to degree velocity. So where are your best opportunities from a student success lens to either ensure that you're offering something from a schedule perspective or maybe structurally change the pathway? So I'll give you an example. We had an institution that for all of their math and computer science majors, it assumed that the student was coming in with calculus. But we know, based on the data, that about 40% of the students actually came in with calculus. So automatically, all the students that are on those math and computer science, 60% of the students are off track in the first term. So it makes you kind of think through, okay, should we update the pathway to account for our majority use case, which is that the students that are coming in, even though they want to pursue math, they're not quite ready for that first calculus level course. Do we want to change that up? Do we want to offer maybe fewer sections of calculus and instead it's a pre-cal? So that's an example of the type of analysis that I would be considering is
Okay.
Sort of structurally what isn't making sense. And usually, you know, the two factors are kind of the easy way is what courses haven't filled, what courses are completely filled. That's what we've always done in schedule refinement. Take it a step further. Where can we identify bottlenecks where students aren't flowing through the pathways the way that we want them to? And that would be what I would target.
Great. Thanks. You must have known I was looking at math enrollments this morning, so.
That was a happy coincidence.
Yeah, and also the recognition we're having to schedule more sections of the math courses earlier in the sequence for the very kinds of reasons you're identifying there.
Sure, 100%. That's a pretty common thing that we're running into as well.
Right, thanks.
Hey, is there anyone else? We've got plenty of time scheduled, so please feel free. We are scheduled to go to the half past the hour, so if you've got time to spend with us, we're happy to stay on and talk with you. Okay, Laura, I'm going to toss you another question.
Okay.
In step one, you talked about establishing goals for moving to an annual scheduling process. And I love that step. I wonder what kind of pre-work or groundwork from a change management perspective might you suggest to prepare the campus stakeholders for what's to come?
Yeah, it's a great one, and I think you're probably better qualified to answer your own question, actually. But I'll let you weigh in a moment. I think the key is to ground the work in the student success lens. Like I think you guys are probably hearing that I'm kind of hammering that a little bit, but I think if you think about that why that I was speaking to, I think that's where you can get these stakeholders on board. And I think if they just see it as another task, as now we just want to schedule more in advance. You know, I think we have to ground it in helping students be successful. I have a good friend, Susan Lee, and has worked in a number of institutions, and she says when faced with the data, faculty will make the right decision, right? And so I think showing them the data on how it can be successful is something that would be really important. I think you could also focus on how it would help them, right? There's a lot of angst, not just from a student's perspective when classes get canceled. I think there's a lot of angst from an instructional perspective when they're consistently being asked to add a few more seats to allow students to get into classes during orientation and registration, right? So those are kinds of things, if you can sell them on the fact that this can benefit them, that they can also have a more structured schedule from a faculty perspective, that they can know ahead of time the needs that they might have. Then that feels like ways to kind of get them on board. And then, so those are maybe two ideas. The third one is to find a champion. So find someone who, maybe it's math, we're just going to continue down that path. Maybe we're going to talk about math and say, hey, can you show how you were able to do this with your schedule and show how it's helped? So we always, you know, kind of find the champions, so to speak. That feels like a strategy that can be used as you're trying to get folks on board. But I would open that back up to you, Lisa, from a change management lens. And I think Kim West is on the call as well. So those are a couple of my ideas, but certainly I'm sure there's a lot of collective wisdom on that topic.
Well, and I love all that. You know, you really added in the piece about helping folks understand how it will not only help the students, but also help them. You know, I just think, you know, back to the planning and how we prepare folks. So just, you know, having empathy that we're going through this, you know, this radical change and keeping focused on what the benefits are. But I'd open it back up to the participants attending who are either going through preparing to change, or Joe, if you have any wisdom and insight from your experience since you're already doing it, that would be lovely to hear. And since it's Zoom, you can't just look away from me now because all right.
I don't know if it's wisdom or anything about it. I mean, the prevailing view is that it helps with retention. So at that sort of more macro level, I think there's some positives out of it. At the chair scheduling level, they sure wish they were doing it still a semester at a time. But I think as we continue to help them look at the data we have available, so we, you know, part of it is we've been moving past scheduling as wish list, right, where everybody fills out a menu of here's what I'd really like to teach and when this semester. So, you know, that is really a problem when you're trying to do annual scheduling. So for chairs who've taken greater advantage of the tools that we have, I think they're being far more successful with annual scheduling.
Thank you. And that just brings to mind too, setting appropriate expectations. So as we focus on student success, and hearing from you, Joe, that folks are still wishing it was the old way, like that is probably a really important and helpful takeaway to say that even once we roll this out, like, you know, we've probably all experienced those instances where as we were doing scheduling at my institution, like I think the first term after, like retention actually went down because of a whole host of factors, right? And certainly as we're dealing with the pandemic too, right? Like we have to have the appropriate expectation. And I think same thing with the comfort level of folks. Is, you know, it's probably unrealistic to say like, we'll switch this and we'll do this once or twice and you'll see how amazing it is. But to just recognize that as you get better, it's an iterative process over time. And, you know, we're going to track and see those results and just keep improving. So thank you for that. Any other comments or areas you'd like Laura to expand on a little bit more? Okay, I see where you're headed, Laura. Go for it.
Oh, my mute. At least once in every meeting, right? I was not trying to cut off the question and answer, by the way. I was just making sure I could advance my slide. So still feel free to put a question in the question and answer or just speak up. But a couple of next steps from our perspective, if you are interested in continuing to advance your annual schedule process, feel free to email us, education@aas.com. We are doing a little cohort with 3 institutions to help move, you know, kind of the thinking ahead from an annual scheduling perspective, doing a couple little sample engagements, building out all the data that you saw to be able to use that from a decision-making perspective. If that's something that you're interested in, please reach out to us. We're very interested in this topic, as you can see. You always have the opportunity to connect with other clients in the schedule refinement community. and we can pop that link in. We do have a lot of Ad Astra apps and support center articles that are available for your use as you're going through this process, both from a schedule refinement perspective, but even beyond. And then we do want to just quickly plug the fact that we do have our Aspire conference coming up in October. And then we're also hoping to open a new course, Managing the Academic Enterprise, probably after the conference in October as well. So good opportunities to continue to make progress down this path. And then we do have a few upcoming trainings as a part of this series. So we have building your spring 2022 schedule using historical and student-specific course demand projections. So those of you that are using Align and Predict, you may want to catch that. Again, most institutions are probably going to be going through that process. I think we have a couple of sessions next week. If you really love to hear the sound of my voice and Lisa as a moderator, I think we'll be doing that on Monday. So feel free to join in. We do have another version of this building an annual schedule webinar that's coming up in September. So if you have some folks from your institutions that you think would benefit from this conversation, that is scheduled about a month from now. And then obviously we have some other things that are coming down the pike, but always glad to have you guys work with us and available as we do training and conversations about scheduling.
We'll be sending links to all of that in your follow-up meeting, follow-up email, excuse me, along with the recording. So I did pop the link to the article in the chat so you could download that while it's still on your mind as well.
Okay, well, I just want to thank you so much for coming. Obviously, this is an important topic to me, something that I feel like I've been talking about for about 10 years, and folks are moving in this direction, which is exciting. So glad to have you on our phone call today. I'm going to stick around for another minute or so. So if you had a question that you didn't want to ask in front of the whole group, then I'm going to stick around for a minute or so. If we don't hear anything else, we'll sign off. But otherwise, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your Friday and a good weekend.